All right, good morning. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction. You're probably wondering, why do we have Ariana Grande? We are going to break free from the measurement systems that are leading you astray, and we're going to talk about how cross-device changes everything. It changes the way you measure, it changes the way you look at your business, and it moves you from thinking about cookies or devices to thinking about real people. As he mentioned, I'm Jaysen Gillespie. I've worked at Criteo for about 4 years. I oversee data science and analytics, so there's two good things about that. First, I'm not here to sell you anything. Second, we have a lot of awesome data that we're going to talk about going forward. Hopefully that's enough to keep you here for at least 24 minutes, because I'm not going to make it on good looks and humor. That's okay. This is not a Tinder meetup. It's eTail West. So let's get on with the show. First thing, let's take a step back. As digital marketers, as e-commerce professionals, one of the things that we see going on in the industry is that the number of topics that you need to address is at an all-time high. While you'll hear a lot about consolidation in the industry, there's some consolidation, but it's a consolidation of companies at the long tail within their business. In retargeting, which is obviously near and dear to my heart, you used to have many more retargeters, but a lot of them are falling off the map now, and you're left with the ones that have scale. So you still need to understand retargeting, but now you need to understand a lot of other companies and a lot of other pieces of innovation that are going on out there. There was a time, it was brief, but there was a time where people thought, oh, well, if I get Facebook and I get Google, I think I got this thing. No, nothing could be farther from the truth. Look at the exhibit hall out there. That's innovation. In fact, what does the Google booth look like out there? Did anyone stop by the Facebook booth? Let me know when you do. The people out there is what you should be interested in, because that's where the innovation and the competitive advantage and the next piece of vendor management is going to come from. Some of the things that are going to affect you are going to be cross-device, which I'm going to talk about here. Attribution is still a huge topic. Third-party verification, fraud prevention, and then anything that's based on machine learning and artificial intelligence is really the next frontier, not just in digital marketing, but in much of what we do. So we want to give you our point of view regarding where should you focus on developing internal expertise, and where should you say, you know what, I'm going to let some vendors do this, but I'm going to really learn how to manage them. Interesting sign I saw here, the West LA Car Wash and Deli near my house. Sparkling clean hubcaps, amazing hot pastrami. You probably don't want the same guy doing both of those, right? For the same reason, you're not going to be amazing at everything. So you're going to have to pick and choose. There's just not enough hours in the day. So internal expertise. Our view is that the #1 way for you to obtain long-term success and competitive advantage is to make sure that you really understand your consumer. Understand everything about that consumer as best you can. What are they doing on your site? What are they doing in interactions with your marketing? What's working? How do you handle sales attribution? How do you develop a robust test and learn paradigm across your organization? And how do you stay current with new media? On the flip side, there's probably a lot going on with vendors that you still want to participate in and benefit from, but that's going to be external expertise. You're probably not going to develop your own solution where machine learning is involved, or requires a big data cluster, or requires a huge engineering effort, because these are things that maybe you could get away with if you were the top 2 or 3 companies, but for the vast majority, you need to understand how to best leverage what you can get from vendors. My goal here today is to have you walking out of this talk saying, Jaysen, that was interesting. Whether or not you work with Criteo, these are some good thought starters, and these are questions that you should be thinking about. And at the end of the deck, I'm going to give you a little bit of a mini roadmap as to how you can leverage what's going on in the cross-device world in your own business. So with that said, I'm going to present some real-world studies and data from the Criteo data set, which is thousands of retailers right here in the US. Where it really will benefit your internal understanding about what your consumers are doing. So we're going to do 2 parts. The first part is we want to look at our underlying identity graph. And we've spent a couple years building this because we decided to do it sort of slow and steady instead of fast and furious. So slow and steady means that in order to connect all of the world's devices, or as many as we can get our hands on, we want to be able to do it on an exact match basis. So instead of using probabilistic methodologies, we actually asked a lot of our retail partners to give us an MD5 of an email address so that if you transacted on one retailer on one device and you later transacted on another retailer on another device, but with the same email, which most of us do, let's face it, then we could match those together. Is it perfect? No, it's the internet. Of course it's not perfect. If you want perfect, you should be working at Price Waterhouse, as long as you're not doing the Oscars. If you want to do something meaningful, though, the internet's a great space because there's always a little wiggle room there. So we developed an exact match underlying identity graph so that we could have robust data around how people are interacting across devices. And what we want to do is prove that that effect is everywhere. And we also want to prove that the participation by retail partners in this sort of joint project actually brings benefit to not just the whole, but to each participating retailer. In the second part of this talk, I'm going to focus on what are the effects of the cross-device world in terms of the metrics that you see and what you care about: conversion rates, add-to-basket rates, checkout rates. And then we're going to look at cookie-based metrics versus person-based facts. So let's start by understanding, does this make sense? There's a lot of animation here, so you'll see me clicking. But first question, let's talk about the world we live in right now. What fraction of users in the US who were shown an ad in late Jan 2017 were known on 2 or more devices? Now this is actual Criteo data, so it means they were shown a Criteo ad and they're a US client. Raise your hand if you think it's 72%. Awesome. You guys can leave. You already know this. That's the right answer. 72% did this in the United States. We have data for other countries. It's not our focus of this talk because A, it's lower, and B, it's still growing. But I wanted to point out that the US and even Canada, oddly, it seems to be a North American phenomenon where there's an extraordinary ability to find people on more than one device. If you think about that 72% number, it's really amazing. Because it means that when an ad is shown to someone, there's a 72% chance, and I think this was in the last 14 days before that ad was shown, that we saw them on another device somewhere else within our advertiser or advertising network. We also wanted to understand, does this affect all of you? Does this affect just a subset of you? Or does this affect all of you, and what is the range like? So I apologize that this graph's a little bit complicated, but what it basically represents is the distribution of Criteo clients as a function of the percentage of matched users, and you can see that it's kind of a bell curve centered around that 72%, where most clients have a number that falls between 65 and 85. So this validates the idea that cross-device is not so much about the client, and in fact, even the bottom quartile, the number is still 60%, but the cross-device world that we're in is a function of how users want to interact. It's a function of how users want to use your site for research and for later purchase. And when we looked at this by vertical, we actually got the same exact results. While it varies a little bit from 68 to 74%, that's not an enormous variation. In fact, that variation is so small, we blew out retail, and we saw the same exact thing. So if you're a fashion client, you're right there in the middle at 72%, a little lighter in tech, a little heavier in health and beauty. Point being, this effect is not related to what you're selling. It's not related to the vertical you're in. It's occurring because it's how consumers want to use devices. Okay, so let's talk about this underlying identity graph that I've referred to. There's 2 ways you can organize and manage an identity graph. You can be a closed system, which works well if you're someone like Google or Facebook, because you inherently have so much scale. People are logging in, hopefully cross devices if you're them, and then you can connect those people, and that's an exact match methodology, and I think that works very well for them. The problem with a closed system is that it essentially builds a wall around your data and makes you pay for it. And we don't think that that's the most effective way to manage data in this kind of open internet network that we have. So we wanted to prove that even though there's that coalescence by certain large players around the closed strategy, if we studied how much value any one retailer was distributing into the system, compared it to how much value we could export back out via those matches that are made, we would hope to be able to find that the value exchange is favorable for participating retailers. So we undertook a study to do this, and this is one reason why I call it identity as an innovation has now become very popular. While I love what Criteo is doing on an exact match basis, there's also some merit to doing things on a probabilistic basis, which is where you don't have to have an exact match. And there are a number of companies, some are out here, and I'd encourage you to speak with them also about what they're doing. Because identity is now something that we're all innovating around, and the reason, and I'll talk about this in part 2, the reason we're spending all this time and effort is because it powerfully affects your ability to touch users at the right time and drive more sales. So let's talk about how this favorable exchange of value empowers you. We went and we looked at the actual data. And we get these MD5s from retailers, and we also get them from publishers because Criteo sort of sits between publishers and retailers. And when we looked at all of the matches that are made in this pool, it turns out that only about 8% come from the single largest participant if we look at just matches from clients, and that number drops to 1.6% if we consider all the matches. That was a really good sign. We also then looked at, well, what is the number for the median provider? And it's only 0.4. So if we represent this as a picture, you can see that we have all these users out there, and there's a big pool of matches, but the typical participant who provides data is only creating 0.4% of the matches, but hopefully you're getting the benefit of all 100% of the matches. So that's 2 orders of magnitude greater value distributed back to the system than value put into the system. We think that that's a powerful effect, and it's something that's going to allow even mid-size or small e-commerce players to have the same scale in this facet as Amazon or as anyone else who's at scale. There's very few at-scale retailers. If you think about e-commerce, there's one gigantic e-commerce player with maybe 30–40%. There's a few guys that are pretty big with 3 or 4%, and then there's a ton of people with 0.03, 0.1%. How do we give the power that the guy with 33% has to everyone else? Well, we do that by joining all the data together and then having an exchange of value that's favorable for everyone from top to bottom. So why do we do this? Now that we realize the effect is there, let's look at what happens when you're in a cross-device world. Let's start by asking a basic fact. How well do you understand consumers who are on multiple devices in order to research and then purchase on your websites? Ask another poll question here. What fraction of transactions, now this is important because these are people who actually bought something. They love your brand, they know your brand, they bought something on your website. What fraction of transactions have a visit from another disconnected ID within the last 14 days? Raise your hand if you think it's 26%. So I didn't fool many of you because I did the right answer the first time. This time it's 38. Thank you for the few people who were bold and brave and put your hands up and participated. This is an enormous number. What this means is almost 4 out of every 10 transactions that you're seeing are potentially disconnected from prior user behavior from that same human being in many of your systems. That has a lot of implications around your marketing for companies like us that do retargeting, your web analytics. There's a whole host of reasons why that can potentially derail what you're trying to do. And here's where you can see the deck changes a little. So love our marketing team. They make beautiful decks. These look like I made them on the car ride over from Santa Monica, but that's because I needed the full screen. So I had to get rid of some of the niceties here, and I apologize that this is a bit of an eye chart. If you're in the back row, it's a little small. But what each one of these bars represents is a device of purchase. So for example, if you look at the far right, those are folks who bought something on a Criteo client on an iPhone. Happening more and more. But where were they when they were on the same retailer's site but not on the iPhone in the last 14 days? Well, that's what the color represents. And you'll notice there's this big, beautiful sky blue bar that runs across the chart. That's actually desktop. Well, we thought that was really interesting because the urban legend was supposed to be that people research on mobile and then buy on desktop. How can this be? They're researching on desktop and then buying on mobile. Both ends of the chart show that. So it started getting us thinking, maybe urban legends aren't always true. So we went back and we said, well, what if we look at the last 3 devices? Apologies again, this is a very complicated chart. But the middle section That pie chart is the distribution of transactions by device. Sky blue is desktop, the others are mobile or in-app. The next ring around shows you two interesting things. One, if you extend outwards in radius from the center point and it's blank, that means there was no prior device. So people where we only saw them on one device, and that's that 60%. Of the 40% where we did see them on another device, we've colored it based on what that device was. So you can see that there's a huge chunk where it's desktop and then desktop, but there's also about 40% where it's desktop and then mobile. And if you go back from the second device to the third device, guess what? You see the same thing. What does this mean? This means that we believe we can put to death the urban legend about researching on mobile and purchasing on desktop. It just doesn't seem to be true. What does seem to be true? Research on what's convenient, buy on what's convenient. Again, this is different than what we may have seen 2 years ago. Urban legends are usually true for a reason. There's some kernel of truth, but things change over time. And we think that this data is very recent. It's largely December and January of 2016 and 2017. So we think that this is what the world has morphed to. The other thing I want to mention here is what happens when we do a study of the time between when a transaction occurs, and now imagine looking backwards in time until you see a prior device. So we broke down that gap by deciles for all the users who made a transaction. And what we found was we actually see that prior device 30% of the time, that's where the 1 day bar is, within 1 day. So those three vertical columns, each column represents 10% of the transacting users. Within just 1 day, we saw that person looking backwards on another device. In 4 days, we see 5 deciles, or 50% of the population. We thought this was a very interesting finding because what it means is that there is a strong propensity towards the use of multiple devices as consumers converge towards a decision, a transaction being a decision because it's an irrevocable commitment of resources, although I guess they could return. No one has returns here, right? No, just kidding. Okay, little e-commerce humor. So what this means also based on the color of the bars is that desktop tends to be a device for research as you go farther back in time, and as you get closer to the point of transaction, the research device tilts towards mobile. Well, this is very interesting because this lets us refine our urban legend. Maybe our urban legend should now be, when people are researching on mobile, they are more likely to do it almost immediately before a transaction. When people are researching on desktop, they're more likely to do it further in the past. That makes sense. That's what the data is saying. The other thing we wanted to understand was stay versus switch. So there are those who research on the same device, even though that device may be disconnected because of cookie deletion or because of issues with the Safari browser. It could be somebody who's using 2 browsers on a desktop. So there are a lot of people that are switchers, even though they're on the same physical device. And then there are those that don't switch. And we notice the same sort of effect, whereas desktop is more prevalent as you get back into the higher deciles, the longer time before purchase. The people who switch are more front-loaded. So what that means is it's very important to understand what's going on in that critical golden 24 hours before a transaction. Why is this fun? This is fun because you don't know it's 24 hours before a transaction because a transaction hasn't occurred yet unless you're either clairvoyant or maybe extraordinarily good at predictive modeling. So I call these alternative facts. I wanted the experts to come. Of course, Kellyanne and Sean Spicer. Kellyanne turned me down. Spicy said his boss had him on travel ban this week, so you're stuck with just me. What this means is if you reframe your metrics from what you're seeing in your systems, cookie-based systems, and the conversion rate is probably the most important one of these, they will move from numbers like 6% all the way up to numbers like 9%. And that's because you have a lot of disconnected cookies out here that end up being human beings that convert elsewhere. And if you can't tie those together, you have this population of cookies that you basically want to write off. You're saying those people aren't that engaged, those people aren't buying anything, but those human beings are buying something. The other thing that's interesting is that as you can connect those dots further back in time, you'll notice that the path to purchase itself is extended. So instead of just taking 2.9 times on your website to have a transaction, that number rises all the way to 4.1 times. That's a fairly significant difference. It's 41% more. The other thing, and this is not all retailers, this is a subset, but we wanted to really look at what happens as we find more and more cookies or devices out there. As you can imagine, it's a huge fraction of the audience, but those people convert at higher rates and with a correspondingly lower CPO. But you can't address them that way, and you can't segment them out unless you know it's the same person on 3 cookies. So what are the tactical challenges, the specific tactical challenges that you're going to face because of this? So the first one is in brand and prospecting. Now, this is eTail, so a lot of you are focused on driving performance, and that's awesome. We do that too. But who does brand buys? Who does prospecting? Who tries to get a new person to your site? Okay, no one. Good. Then you're not wasting your money. Why are you wasting your money? Because a lot of prospecting is going against a cookie that's, quote, never been to your site. That may be factually true. But if that human being has already been to your site, you're wasting your money. It's not a prospecting buy. That's why prospecting is so squishy. If you're branding, let's say you have a brand campaign and you want to run a frequency of 4 ads per user. What you really want is 4 ads per human being. You don't care about 4 ads on a desktop or 4 ads then on a mobile for me. I've already seen my 4 ads. So you're very likely exposing not enough human beings and way overexposing them. So branding is another piece of the marketing ecosystem that is hugely affected by cross-device. Site experience. While most of us have a marketing slant here, there's a lot to be said for making your site as good as possible. You can imagine the unconnected people aren't going to work well with A/B test results because you may put me in group A on my desktop and group B on my laptop at home, and I should probably be consistently sorted in the same group across tests. It's going to make suboptimal recommendation because you're not aware of what I was browsing on my other device at work. And it's going to lose the ability to do personalization. It's also going to really throw off your propensity to buy models. If you love data science like me, and you go home and you dream about propensity to buy modeling, what you're going to find is that it doesn't work really well if you can't bring in all the data from a given person into that person's unique ID. Finally, retargeting. You're going to lose the ability to cross-sell the complementary products that were purchased on another device. You may show products that were already purchased, which we all know is a big no-no in retargeting, and you're going to have a lower ROI. So how do you address this? I've thrown out a lot of challenges. I've thrown out some data. Where do you go from here? Well, the first thing is most of you work with at least some set of vendors that could probably address this in some way or other. If you work with Criteo, great, talk to us. If you work with someone like Criteo, great, talk to them. Or if you have a vendor that specifically does cross-device, they could probably pull this sort of data for you. You might also have an internal group, and don't underestimate the ability of your internal analytics team to do your own mini cross-device study. You can't get the scale that a big industry player can have. But you know what you can do is you can use your own CRM ID or something like that to link your buyers who buy from you on 2 devices, and that at least builds your internal tribal knowledge about how people are using your website. Next, do the math. So think about what's really important for you as you pull the specific data and you translate the path to purchase from devices into persons. Maybe conversion rate is your most important thing. Maybe ROI. Maybe add to basket rates. Convert all these into user-based metrics. Here comes the hard part, because this is where you have to get IT involved. How do you integrate this data into your systems? So let's say that a partner could send you awesome matches. You still need to do something with them. So maybe that's bringing it into your own data warehouse. Maybe that's bringing it into your DMP. Maybe that's aligning it with your attribution system. That's where the rubber meets the road, because now you're taking the data, you're convinced it means something, and you've got to merge it all together with your other systems. This is a midterm thing. And then finally, and this is more conceptual and almost has to be something that permeates the DNA of the organization, reorient. Move to a user-centric paradigm. The good news is, a lot of vendors, even Facebook, Google, people like Criteo, other companies, we believe in the user. We believe everything revolves around the user. We believe everything should be user-centric. There's really no such thing as buying a specific website or buying a device. Everything's about the user, and we see that trend only picking up steam here, but it is going to take a little bit of jujitsu to get your systems to line up the way they need to be to take advantage of it. I realize I'm on 0, so a big French merci beaucoup for your time. And that's it.
Thank you, Jaysen.